You're listening to Once Upon a History. Here is the story of Sacagawea, Bird Woman. Once upon a harvest moon, as the sun was falling into the vast western sky, setting the leaves alight with color, a group of men appeared on the horizon. Their foreign clothing and heavy bearing felt out of place among the small village of Mandan and Minatari Indians. A young Shoshone woman stood still, watching the unexpected company trudge closer. Wary of strangers, she instinctively touched her pregnant belly, protecting her unborn child. Squinting against the setting sun, she saw an enormous dog bounding toward her. Tail wagging, tongue lapping, the excited Newfoundland ran straight for Sacagawea. She stood her ground, despite its huge size, and received what can only be called a smile from the friendly pup. She held out her hand for him to sniff and was rewarded with a slobbery nuzzle. And that unusual handshake was how she met the friendly giant Seaman and his corps of discovery. Sacagawea soon learned that the large group of American men were explorers bound for the Western Sea. Sent by President Thomas Jefferson himself, these pioneers were instructed to map the route west, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Their excitement was catching, and she walked home with a slight skip in her step. Her husband was a fur trader named Charbonneau. He had a heart for adventure and a head for money. When Sacagawea entered their teepee, she was surprised to learn he too knew of the American surveyors. And what's more, he wanted to join them. The foreigners planned to cross the Bitterroot Mountains and acquire horses from the Shoshone tribe. He was certain the Americans would pay for their assistance. Sacagawea's eyes sparkled. The Shoshone tribe. Her people. Her tribe. The next morning, the couple made their way to the explorers' camp. As they approached, Sacagawea's new friend Seaman raced toward her. Charbonneau stopped abruptly at the sight of the immense animal, but his wife moved forward gracefully, greeting the eager pup with a strategic scratch behind his left ear. Captain Lewis looked up from his journal, noting the small woman's courage in the face of his friendly giant. As custom dictated, Sacagawea waited outside the cabin while her husband introduced himself to the expedition's captains, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. But quickly, the astute men realized that the unassuming young woman, no more than 16 years old, would be incredibly valuable to their mission. She could speak several languages, and her skills would help them communicate and befriend those they met along the way. They politely bid her inside and asked if she would join them on their journey. Before she could reply, Charbonneau rudely agreed for both of them. But despite her husband's lack of chivalry, Sacagawea was excited. It had been 5 long years since she'd seen her home and her family, but always they lived in her heart. With the frost fast approaching, the explorers were forced to wait until the wintry world thawed. Despite the fierce cold, the expedition didn't stay idle. They used their enforced encampment to build new boats, light enough to be carried on land and sturdy enough to haul the company's cumbersome stores of food and supplies. The only woman of the party, Sacagawea didn't laze either. On the coldest day of winter, her cabin covered in a blanket of fresh white snow, the inexperienced girl gave birth. The useless men fretted for her well-being, but the young mother was calm. Legend claims she used a traditional Shoshone powder of rattlesnake tail to ease her labor, and within 10 minutes, she had a precious baby boy in her arms. Charbonneau named his son Jean-Baptiste, while the smitten Clark dubbed the infant Pomp, for the chubby child was cherished indeed. Just 7 weeks later, Sacagawea strapped newborn Pomp to her back in a cradleboard and joined the rest of the voyagers in their newly built boats, paddling west. With every stroke, the men left home further and further behind. But Sacagawea, well, she was on her way home. At night, the party made camp while Sacagawea foraged for wild artichokes and picked currants and gooseberries for some sweet relief. By the dying light of the campfire, Sacagawea and Captain Clark formed a true friendship as Clark bounced little Pomp on his knee. One night, as he stoked the flames, Clark asked Sacagawea about her name. "What does Sacagawea mean?" he questioned. "Bird woman," she replied. She then explained that Shoshone children often had many names in their youth until their character was fully revealed. "Bird woman," repeated Clark, and he smiled. This little woman with her gentle touch and slender frame was a bird. She almost seemed to fly, her nimble feet barely touching the ground as she flitted from rock to rock. "It's perfect," he said. Sacagawea grinned. On a chilly spring morning, as Sacagawea, Clark, and Lewis walked along the shore, a great gust of wind struck the boat steered by Charbonnet. Sacagawea watched in horror as the craft swiftly filled with water. The men urgently bailed out the sinking vessel. Pomp screamed in distress, and her husband desperately held the side of his capsized canoe, attempting to right it. The watchful bird woman was the only one to notice their essential provisions drifting away. She hastily removed Pomp's cradleboard, setting him down gently on the riverbank before dashing into the rapid current, desperate to retrieve the indispensable supplies. After every man was safe on land, Lewis and Clark turned their attention to Sacagawea. Without her, they said, the entire voyage would be finished. Her quick thinking saved their papers, instruments, books, and medicines, all of the necessary equipment to complete their mission. To honor her, they proclaimed the creek Bird Woman's River, after their intrepid interpreter. The heroic bird woman smiled softly, clutching Pomp to her chest and rocking him gently. As the voyage turned north, the temperatures plummeted. Rain and snow hampered their progress, and the men waded into icy water up to their shoulders, pulling the heavily laden canoes. Every day was hard. The explorers were exhausted, and poor Pomp was plagued by mosquitoes, his little body covered in itchy red welts. When Bird Woman took ill with a foul fever, the entire party worried for her safety and for their future. Without her, the men had little hope of success. Who would help them trade with the Shoshone for the essential horses? Who would identify poisonous berries or point out life-saving herbs? And who would care for Pomp should his mother die? Lewis and Clark took turns tending to Sacagawea. For 3 weeks, they brought her restorative tea and iron-rich water. They repaid her courage and skills with tender care and heartfelt concern. Thankfully, the small but mighty bird woman recovered. But as her health improved, the conditions deteriorated. Without rivers to propel the boats, wheels were fashioned from slices of tree trunk and added to the boat-turned wagons, which were then awkwardly pushed across the compact ground. Bears lurked in the dense forests, though the mighty seaman made himself useful. He barked all night long to frighten away the beasts. And then, the storms came. Walking along the riverbank with her husband and Clark, Sacagawea felt a raindrop hit her cheek, then another, and another. Soon, the small shower turned into a torrential downpour. Without warning, a flood of water roared down the ravine and engulfed the travelers. Instantly, the water was waist-high and rising. Charbonnet and Clark worked together to pull Sacagawea to safety. But as she clung to her husband's hand, Pomp's cradleboard came loose and was swept away. Sacagawea only barely managed to keep hold of her baby boy by one hand. This lucky escape was followed by giant hailstones pummeling their camp. Several of the men were hurt by the enormous rocks of ice falling from the sky. But through it all, the bird woman clung to her child, shielding his tiny body with her own. Despite their immense trials, the Corps of Discovery persevered, and eventually, Bird Woman began to recognize familiar landmarks. Her family once camped by that stream. She'd played tag amongst those very trees. Her eyes glistened with tears of joy. But joy turned to concern as the days passed with no sign of her people. After weeks of searching, the explorers finally spotted 3 Shoshone women in the distance. They approached slowly, arms open to signal friendship. The women bowed their heads in fear, but after an exchange of hand gestures, along with peace offerings of beads and mirrors, the women felt safe enough to escort the party to their village. They were met by 60-strong Shoshone warriors, thundering toward them on huge horses. The chief greeted Captains Lewis and Clark. He was warm, but wary. Looking into the distance, he saw a striking young woman, somehow familiar, dressed in traditional Shoshone garb with a distinctive belt of blue beads hanging around her waist. Sacagawea, overcome with emotion, stopped and stared at her people. She paused for a long time until suddenly she began to dance with joy. The chief instantly recognized the celebratory Shoshone steps and opened his arms to the strangers in welcome. As Sacagawea stepped forward, she locked eyes with the chief, and instantly, she began to cry. Rushing forward, she threw her arms around him and hugged her brother, Kameoate. Sacagawea's body collapsed in delight, and her brother, the chief, returned her earnest embrace. It was the happiest of reunions. The Corps of Discovery stayed with the Shoshone for a few days as Lewis and Clark bargained for horses and supplies. In addition to translating, Sacagawea met old friends, spent time with her long-lost family, and proudly presented her precious parcel, Pomp. But before long, it was time to move on. The 2 groups exchanged reluctant goodbyes, and the voyagers resumed their journey, this time on horseback. It was very hard for the Bird Woman to bid her family, her friends, and her people goodbye. Throughout their final push to the Pacific Ocean, they encountered many indigenous American tribes. The explorers worried they might encounter hostility, but the men were incredibly relieved to discover that the presence of Bird Woman and Pomp signaled peace to tribal leaders, and they were welcomed wherever they went. Step by step, they inched closer to their destination. Soon, their senses awoke to the smell of the ocean air, the salt tickling their taste buds. They had done it. They had reached the western shore. While out scouting, the men stumbled across a whale washed ashore. It was a once-in-a-lifetime sight, and the whale's fatty blubber proved a welcome and tasty treat to the hungry explorers. However, no one thought to invite Sacagawea, and she was hurt. She went to Captain Clark and spoke honestly. She would have liked to see the monstrous fish, she said. It was rude and inconsiderate. Clark was so embarrassed. Sacagawea had saved them all time and again. She deserved their gratitude, their respect. How could they have been so thoughtless? He sincerely apologized and promised that she would never again be excluded. She was equal to any and all men on this expedition. Soon it was time to return home. Though not as challenging as their outbound journey, it certainly wasn't easy. Hunger and illness continued to plague the explorers, who were all extremely grateful for the Bird Woman and her herbal medicines. 2 years after first arriving in the small Mandan and Minatari village, the Corps of Discovery returned. Here, the explorers said goodbye to the little family. Clark especially struggled to leave. He held little Pomp for as long as he could and left Sacagawea with assurances that he would always care for her and the little boy. Should she ever need him, he said, she had only to ask. When they began their quest, Lewis and Clark needed a translator. Little did they know the survival of their corps and the completion of their entire mission would rest in Sacagawea's small, delicate hands. At just 16 years old, this brave young woman crossed America with her newborn baby strapped to her back, and history was forever changed by Sacagawea's remarkable strength.